not before like anybody else, right? Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Josh Franco, a political science professor at Cayucos Community College in El Cajon, California. That's down in San Diego County. You could have read his bio on our website, so I'm not going to bore you with all those details, although it's quite interesting. I want to tell you a little bit of why we invited him to speak. Several months ago, he sent us a copy, an abstract, and a copy of a paper he wrote about his study of grand jury effectiveness, with the premise of wondering whether or not a non-democratically selected body of people could really be an effective force in evaluating local governments. We found it quite interesting. We published the summary in the journal with a link to the full paper. I hope some of you had a chance to write it. We learned in discussion with Josh that he has applied to the National Science Foundation for a funded study of this very premise. And we've indicated our official support to that study to the National Science Foundation. And we're hopeful that that study will be granted funds, and he will launch into a very detailed study of what we've been talking about before. So that's why we invite him to talk about it and tell us his views about this entire subject. And with that, I'll turn it over to Josh.
So thank you, Jerry, for that introduction. Really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my screen so we can be on the same page here. Make sure I have the right one. Let's see. And if you can give me a thumbs up if you can see the title slide for the deck. I think we're good. Alrighty. And then let's see. Just minimize that. And I'm going to post in the chat if I could. I might have lost it, the chat. That's fine. So as long as you can see the presentation, I think we'll be squared away. And I'll post a link to the slide deck so you can have access to it in the future. All right. So good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me.
How much longer?
Welcome to my presentation on civil grand juries and underutilized oversight mechanism. I'd like to start off with some thank you. So Barbara Summer for responding to my email that I sent a handful of months ago. Jerry Louie for following up, Bob Finlayson for following up with Jerry, Lou for the phone call inviting me to this annual meeting, and then obviously to the board in general and to the association overall. So thank you to each of you for the opportunity. So first, I'll start with the definition of what political science is. And political science is the study of who gets what, when, where, how, and why. The discipline is over a century old. We have a really healthy national association, regional associations, and political science is taught at the high school level in AP government and government courses. It's taught at the community college level, at our four-year universities, and in graduate programs around the country. And so in thinking about what political science is, it's basically a lens by which to understand the world. One of many academic disciplines like sociology, anthropology, psychology, and so on. And so what we focus on is this particular study of who gets what, when, where, how, and why. Now, there's been prior research on this general concept of oversight. And as you all are well aware, given your experiences with civil grand juries and your other life experiences, that oversight is just a part of government and what it does. But when we think about oversight in an academic or in a disciplinary sense, the way we understand it is informed by what I call two of the three legs of national, international, and local governments. So national governments like the US Congress or legislatures in general have informed our understanding of oversight. And this actually has been the body in which most of our understanding about oversight as a concept is drawn from. So like, how does Congress organize itself? How does it have committees? How do the committee chairmen decide the agenda? How do they go about call witnesses? How do they investigate issues that are front and center versus issues that are passive, and so on? The idea of oversight is also informed by international bodies like the United Nations or international non-governmental organizations. But what's really interesting is that when we think of oversight as a discipline in political science, at the local level, it's not really it's not contributing as much as it could to our idea of oversight or to our concept of oversight. And so given this limitation, I wrote a conference paper little over a year ago now, titled Quasi-Judicial Oversight of Legislative and Executive Branches at the Local Level. And I used the California's county civil grand juries as an example of this quasi-judicial oversight. And the reason I called it quasi-judicial is because, as you know, the grand juries are housed within the courts, the superior courts, but then they also serve this, they don't have the court function per se, but they have this oversight function. So I wrote this paper. I presented at various conferences over the past year and a half, 2 years now. And I got some really good feedback from my colleagues in the discipline. And they're just wanting to know more because, as you know, civil grand juries aren't ubiquitous across the country. They're pretty unique to California. And as I've talked with Jerry and Bob, there's other states that have some elements of this, but this isn't like a widespread local institution, say as cities are or county governments are. So I wrote this paper to start to investigate this further. And it's all derived from this general question. And the question is, how can our present state of knowledge on oversight, as well as accountability, representation, and transparency, be informed by the theoretical essence and the empirical existence of local civil grand juries? And so when I say theoretical essence, I'm like the idea that civil grand juries represent in the abstract, which I'll define in a moment. And then their empirical existence is obviously that they exist in California. They have people, they do work, they produce outcomes, they shape behavior. And so when we think about our idea of oversight, we think Congress, we think international organizations, but once we start to add local governments, it might start to help us better understand the idea of oversight. So the specific question I have is, what is the effect of a third-party actor with complete discretionary, investigatory, and information revelation power on the behavior of other political actors and institutions? And what I'll do is I'll unpack each of these concepts. There's 4 of them to kind of get a sense of how civil grand juries are going to, at least in my mind, initially begin to improve our understanding of oversight. So the 4 concepts are third-party actor. Next is discretionary investigatory power. Third is information revelation power. And then lastly is the behavior of other political actors and of institutions. So let's go ahead and get into these concepts. So for our first concept of third-party actor, right, when we think of civil grand juries, in my mind, they're an empirical representation of this type of actor. They're the public watchdog conducting oversight of local governments. And as you know, California has 40 million residents that live across 58 counties. And in each of those counties, we have this civil grand jury. So in essence, you can have oversight internally within the government. You can have oversight by the public through elections, through engagement in between elections. But you also have this third-party actor who can offer oversight independent of the local governments, independent of state governments, independent of national governments, to help improve our understanding of the operations and the goings-on of institutions. Now, when we think of discretionary investigatory power, we have civil grand juries get to decide which local governments to investigate. That means they have discretion. They have the decision to investigate or not investigate is interesting in and of itself, right? So whenever a governmental entity takes action, we're kind of fascinated with it, but we're also fascinated when governments decide not to take action on things. And so both the positive and the negative or the neutral actions that are taken by governmental actors is particularly engaging for political scientists. Now, while we can't observe the process of how a civil grand jury decides which local governments to investigate or not, obviously that's we call a black box. It's confidential, right? It's a part of the nature of civil grand juries. We can observe the process of this outcome, right? So once the civil grand juries produce the report, we see that, okay, they investigated these local governments. Here's their findings. Here there's recommendations. And so this discretionary investigatory power is pretty unique in our system of governance, and it's pretty unique at the local level. So, for example, Congress has discretionary investigatory power because it can decide what elements, what issues, what organizations, companies, or other governments it wants to investigate. And Again, we can't see what they do, but we can see the outcome of that work. So this is something that civil grand juries share with most other oversight like bodies, is that they have some level of discretion. Now, this other type of power is information revelation power, right? So civil grand juries, after conducting their investigation, can reveal information to not only the local government that was being investigated, but also to the public at large. And by revealing this information to local government, it's valuable because it might help break a logjam of inaction with the local government. And also by revealing this information to the public, it can be valuable since it could increase the scrutiny of that local government by residents, the media, and local interest groups. So information in and of itself is obviously interesting, but when it's revealed, right, when it's taken beyond the veil and people now know it's out there, it's public, it really changes the nature, changes the dynamic of how people engage with what that information represents. And so civil grand juries have that function or that ability. The last concept here is the behavior of other political actors and institutions. So political actors, like locally elected officials or their appointees, have to respond or must respond to the findings and recommendations of civil grand juries. I just want to highlight how unique that is of a political institution or of a governmental institution in general. Most of the times that isn't required. Either somebody would have to file a lawsuit in a state or federal court to have information revealed to them. And there's no requirement that there's a response. Obviously, somebody would, defend themselves or they would counteract any actions. But in our system of civil grand juries, it's very prominent to have this, and it's very unique in the sense of how there's engagement and how that engagement is facilitated between an oversight body and the body that's being overseen. And so the structured interaction between civil grand juries and local governments is a concrete form of oversight and accountability, right? We can look to this and say, this actor is taking this action, and now this investigated or overseen actor has to respond line by line, finding by finding, recommendation by recommendation, and they have to do it in a public way. They can't drag it out in the courts for years. They can't hide it through some kind of non-disclosure agreements or other mechanisms by which to keep information private. It's out there for the public to consume and for the interested parties to engage with. So with those four concepts in mind, right, there's a puzzle that emerges from this. This general question of, how can we improve our understanding of oversight, to our specific question of how do these four different concepts of third-party actors, discretionary investigatory power, information revelation power, and the behavior of others shape our things and shape our understanding of the world that we live in. And so the puzzle is twofold. It's systematically unknown, right? How frequently local governments agree or disagree with the findings or accept or reject the recommendations of the grand jury. And as was mentioned earlier in the conference, your association has done some of this initial work to say, let's take a look at all the grand juries or a handful of them. Let's take a look at them in a particular year over time. But imagine if we had that data set of all civil grand juries of all time and all of their reports and all of their findings and all of their recommendations. And then we can begin to investigate what are the patterns that we're seeing? What are some of the themes that we're seeing? What are some of the constants that come along? What are some of the blips on the radar that come and go? What are some of the kind of enduring issues? And what are some of the ephemeral issues that don't last too long? And so with this lack of systematic understanding, right, we have no database of these reports or responses, nor is there scholarship beyond articles in law journals that focus on the normative arguments. And what I mean by normative is opinion, right, as to whether grand juries should exist or not. So while there's a discussion in law journals and other places, like what are these institutions, pro, con, political scientists will think about them as what are they, like what is this institution and how does it work and how does it influence the behavior of others? So this is the positive side or the empirical side that we want to focus on. So in order to help answer this puzzle or to start piecing it together, what I'm working on is solving this puzzle with community college students as researchers. Being a former community college student myself, then transferred to the university and then worked in government for a while, as you saw in my bio, and then came back to get my graduate degrees. Returning to a community college now as a professor is really exciting because I get to introduce my students to the discipline, but I also can create opportunities for them. And one opportunity I really want to ensure that my students have and that students across the community college system have is this opportunity to conduct research. So to help solve this puzzle with community college students as researchers, I formed the Civil Grand Jury Lab at Cuyamaca College. And here you see a screenshot of our advisory committee for the lab. And so the lab is an undergraduate research lab that helps to create these particular opportunities for students to engage and study these civil grand juries. And most of these, each of these folks here are either current or one is a current student, the other are former students at various levels of their early careers. Some work at law firms, some work in the state legislature, some are university students. And the idea was to help guide us as we're thinking about how we create these structured research opportunities for students, starting at my college and hopefully expanding as the years go by. So what's this mentored research experience that we're looking for? It's basically to help these 2 years college students develop the knowledge, skills, and abilities in the following areas: data collection and coding, formal model development analysis, which is basically using logic and mathematics to more precisely explain what the interaction and the relationships are between, say, civil grand juries and the local governments that they oversee. Conducting qualitative analyses, things like a case study of a particular county grand jury, or process tracing, like how they developed their report and how they reported it out. And then quantitative analysis using statistics and econometrics, which is like, say we have a database of the activities of every civil grand jury in a given year. Now we have a cross-sectional database that we can analyze using statistical and econometric models to see what the relationship is between independent variables or causes of interest and the effects of those causes. The broader impacts of this work that we're embarking on is first to have these activities be thoroughly introduced to two-year students, most of whom are first generation, low income, or minoritized students, to the entire research cycle. I just want to express how restrictive the current system is in creating opportunities for community college students. When I was a community college student, there weren't research methods courses, there weren't even very few research opportunities unless you're working with the faculty who's like getting their PhD. Luckily, I was at a college where one faculty was getting his PhD, so he had me collect data for him as a part of his dissertation work. But for the most part, because community college faculty are teaching professors, they're not engaged in the research of things. It doesn't have that natural opportunity for students, but it's also this ethos within higher education that all community colleges do is teach. And I want to demonstrate that that's not the case. That our students are just as well capable of doing research in their first and second year as a student who decides after high school or after being in the workforce for a number of years, are non-traditional students, that they can come to community college for their first 2 years of their higher education and have exposure to this opportunity. Secondly, we want to serve as a model for undergraduate research conducting original research. So it's not common to have research labs at community colleges, and it's not common to students and to faculty to have that kind of interaction and what it means. So my hope is by doing this type of work, by applying for that National Science Foundation grant and others, that we can demonstrate that, yeah, community colleges are a bed, a petri dish to help students learn about things in the social sciences just as much as in the others. And then lastly is to create this unique database of civil grand jury reports that would be accessible to students, faculty, researchers, county grand jurors like yourself, the state courts, the state legislature, the media, and the general public, so that they can begin to understand and go through the database how they wish, and knowing that there'll be others who will conduct research on the data that we collect. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, did you call on me, Lou?
Lou, you're on mute.
Am I on? Hello? Anybody hear me?
Go
I can
ahead.
hear you,
Lou.
too.
Okay.
Lou, you're muted.
Hmm?
Lou, you're muted.
Okay, well,
I
I
was
was
the
just
problem,
going to
I'm
ask,
sorry.
how can I volunteer to my grand jury and my community college for your work? That sounds awesome.
Yeah, so two ways. The first one is if you have whatever the community college is, and then if you know political science or other instructor, this is open to almost any faculty member that you've either taken in class with or that you're related to, or however the connection's been made.
Right.
Sharing, helping build that bridge. Then we can go from there. I can reach out and see how they would want to engage themselves and or their students in the process.
Yeah, if they would like to. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Larry, go ahead. I see you.
You calling me, Larry?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I wish I had been so innovative to have my students do my research when I was getting my doctorate. That would really I commend you for having them do that. But on a more serious note, in your research, how many states on an annual basis impanel civil grand juries?
So to answer your question, I think 2. And
Which
the one
ones?
I found was California, and then Nevada has something like this, but
Okay.
I didn't go into more detail.
Now, did you go back and do research as to how many may have at one time had them?
To the extent that I could, given time, but I didn't find others. And it wasn't until after this paper, and this is the beauty of research, is that you kind of you work on a question, you try to answer it, and you put it out there, and you start getting feedback. So once I met with Jerry and Bob, they're like, hey, there's like things in Florida that kind of look like this. There's things in Georgia that look like this. So I was taking a whole bunch of notes when we met a few months ago. So those can be future avenues for additional research.
That's where you may go back and trace it back to England, where they originally started. You might do some of that research. But I have a question. What do you do with, and maybe this is with the whole group, what do you do with when you come up with recommendations and you're just blown off and nobody takes it seriously and there appear to be no consequences involved with it?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question. Maybe that's for the board.
Somebody on the board want to answer that?
Well, I'd be happy to step forward a little bit, but there are various things that can be done. I know Marcia would be one. You have the power to reinvestigate and bring the people who decline to act on your recommendations and investigate them yet one more time and find out the reason that they did not implement it, why they overlooked it or decided against doing it. So you have that ability as a subsequent grand jury to go and find out what's holding up them doing what you wanted them to do. And that becomes part of a good, skilled investigation when you bring the people up there and say, why didn't you do this? It made sense. Everything we pointed to looked like this, and this is the problem, and this is the fix. So you can go back, and many grand juries do this and are effective. And on the second or third time, the press get the hold of it, the public gets a hold of it, and action is taken.
It ties back to our earlier presentation because 1718, they dealt with special districts, our grand jury did at that time. And some of those recommendations are still not even implemented.
Diane Hoffman has a comment.
No, I just had a question for Josh because you had commented during your presentation that you're want to accumulate the data on grand jury reports. And I'm sure if you've had these conversations with Jerry, you know that that's available on our website. All county grand juries reports are linked to our website. So it's a really single source for that kind of information. It's part of what we do in training is make sure that all the grand jurors we train know that they can use that as a research for their own going forward, deciding on, what hasn't been looked at or what could be looked at or, what other grand juries across the state have done. And that always was a valuable source for the public too, because the public can access our website and look at those reports also. Also, the state archives has copies of everything.
Yes. And so it's about unpacking those reports. So let me go ahead and share my screen so I can demonstrate what I'm going for. This is a spreadsheet, right? That has, in this case, we're looking at the year. We're collecting data on year, county, local government, title of report, URL, finding number, finding text, etc. So this is just for the county of San Diego for 2013, 2014, and for two of their reports. And the idea is that we need to extract the finding data, in this case, the text, and then we need to extract the response data and then put it into a spreadsheet. Because then what this lets us do is we can do what we call text analysis. We can have students code what these findings are in some kind of grouping. We can use it in what we call grounded theory, which is we can put all the data into a computer and then it'll pop out to us like, here's some themes that it sees based on natural language processing. And so the reports, the data, you're right, is there to the links to the reports. It's now, how do I unpack the reports and then extract the data into basically a set of spreadsheets that can be used that can be then analyzed using.
But at least it's a single source for data. I mean,
yeah.
for the clues, the unpacking part would be, the work that they do to, have the full impact. But I'm sure I've always found that to be one of the most valuable parts, and also the blog part of our website where we, extract newspaper articles across the state of how those reports impacted local press releases and coverage.
Yeah, your blog database is incredible. And it's just, again, it's a matter of how is that put into a format essentially that can be then analyzed further.
Well, that's the work they need to do.
Yeah.
Who has another question for Josh? Go ahead, David. Unmute yourself.
After you get all this research done, is there any cooperative effort with any other researcher to compare the grand jury data from, say, really what old style media investigative reporters used to do without judicial support? Of course, that's the one advantage the grand jury has. But, to compare effectiveness for grand jury reports versus investigative journalists.
I have not thought of that, but that's actually a pretty interesting concept, which is, in other words, you look at oversight, and the way I think about it is you have oversight, and then you have the media conducting oversight, and you have civil grand juries doing oversight, and comparing which one has the stronger effect on local governments. So yeah, that would be something I think a student who's interested in, or a researcher who's interested in oversight bodies or oversight entities, and then their effectiveness over either in one single period or over time. So yeah, I'm making a note. Every time you guys ask me a question, I'm taking notes because they're great ideas.
Okay, I think that's going to wrap up this section. And let me enthusiastically appreciate and thank Josh for coming to us today. Absolutely fascinating stuff. We appreciate it, Josh. We support and will help however we can. We have a new work group to focus exactly on this and work with you. Bob Finlayson is the chair, and we expect to interface and work with you a lot more in the future. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.